Is Western North American culture fundamentally toxic and caustic to our health, mental and physical, and is the medical field ill-equipped to deal with it appropriately? Well, those are some pretty big claims, and that's what the new book, The Myth of Normal, is all about. So let me tell you what I thought. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. I have here a copy of the new book, The Myth of Normal, which is by Gabor Mate, and I had not read anything by him before, but this seemed really interesting. I've been intrigued by him as a thinker for a while. This is the first thing I read by him. This seemed really intriguing to me, especially some of the kind of bold claims it seems to be making. So let me take you through my typical format, main idea, the research behind it, the readability, and my reaction to the book. So the main idea of The Myth of Normal, it's very long and a little bit, I held it up a minute ago, you can see it's pretty big. It's a little long, I'll say more about this at the end, a little unwieldy in some ways. So it's a little difficult to summarize the main idea, but I'm going to give it my best attempt. That the main idea is essentially that our culture, and by our I mean especially North American, like the States, Canada, but broadly Western, that culture, think of culture as, like, he uses the analogy of something that, like, cultures are things that labs, scientific and medical labs will use. Well, they'll create a culture and then kind of test pathogens and stuff inside that culture to see the ways they grow and change and whatnot. He uses that to talk about our culture that we're all living in. And is our culture that we are occupying kind of fundamentally bad for us? Is it bad for our health? And his argument is essentially that the increasing rates of things like poor mental health and also just poor physical health, things like addictions, obesity, suicide rates, I mean, all of that stuff, he would argue it's all of a piece. And it's pointing to a fundamentally, what he would call toxic culture, a culture that is toxic to the occupants, to the inhabitants. It's bad. It's a bad culture to be in, is essentially the argument of the book. But he doesn't just state that. He backs it up with his experience in the medical field, his growing experience in learning more about fields like psychiatry, psychology, therapy, and also spirituality. So it's a very, very, very big, it touches on a lot of areas of science and research and healing and medicine and therapy. I mean, a lot. There's a lot that he uses to back up that claim, but the fundamental claim is that we live in a toxic culture and we need to find a better path to healing and potentially even changing the culture. It's a pretty big argument. So that's my attempt to summarize the main idea of this big book, big in multiple ways. The research behind it is, if you know anything about Mate, I mean, he is a scholar. He is well experienced, lots of experience, a lot of direct experience in the medical field because of his career and his vocation, his background. But he evidences a pretty strong range of an ability to research through first-person research, like he interviews a lot of people. He talks a lot about the interviews he did for this book. He also interviews thinkers and leaders and scholars in the other areas that he has experience in and he's talked about. And he also draws on reading. I mean, he's done the serious work of kind of a medical scholar, and so he knows the research, he knows the fields he's talking about. And it's relatively easy. I usually try to comment on this. It's relatively easy to find what he's getting his data from, so that you can either chase down things on your own or do deeper reading on some of the topics that he touches on. So that's a bit about the research. It's well researched. I'm decently well read in some of these fields, but I'm definitely not well read when it comes to the very strictly medical journals and that kind of side of things. So I'm kind of trusting him as a figure who seems to know that area of research well and how to navigate it. The readability of the book, it is, from a style perspective, extraordinarily readable. For a few reasons. It's written to be approachable. It's written on a popular kind of level. His son co-wrote it with him. I haven't read any of his other books, so I don't know how to compare them, but his son, I think it seems as though his son tried to make sure it was approachable. So it's very, very readable from a page-to-page standpoint. It's also, I say this a lot in books like this, but it has very short chapters. For some reason, that really helps. So, if you're a reader like me, you'll know what I mean. But especially in long books, like 500-page tomes like this, short chapters, for some reason, they make it a lot more readable. I think it's something psychological, makes you feel like you're making more progress in the book or something. Very short chapters, very readable stylistically. However, the other side of this kind of coin is it's very long, and it's a pretty I used the word unwieldy earlier, and I think that's the right word. It goes through so many different areas, so many different topics, and the short chapters mean it almost feels a little bit scattershot. So in that way, it can be a little bit hard to hold together everything that he kind of walks you through, because it is so long, and it just goes through so many different lines of inquiry, different ideas, different aspects of his research. It's kind of all put together. So that's a little bit of a wrinkle on maybe the readability piece, but that leads me into my final thing I want to talk about, which is my reaction to the book. So my reaction to the book was overall very positive. I'm very glad I read this book. I think it's a very, I was going to say important book, and I think I would stand behind that. I would say it's an important book for a couple reasons. First of all, his experience and his story is really gripping. His personal story, and he talks about a lot in the book. There's a little bit of kind of memoir aspects of what he's gone through and the traumas that he's faced himself, but also his experience firsthand in the medical field. So when he critiques the medical field, he knows exactly kind of the experience of it, and he brings that to bear in the book. And I also really admire his attempt to be holistic. It's a remarkable attempt to be holistic. He talks about spirituality, he talks about emotional healing and emotional health. He does also talk about medicine and the necessity of medicine and the gains in the medical field. And so it's a nuanced critique. And he even talks, there's even a chapter on psychedelics and kind of what's happening in the world of psychedelics and kind of awakenings people are having and ways people are finding healing there. So it is a holistic book in its grasp. I think, and I've alluded to this a little bit, I think that's also in some ways the weakness of the book because it is so scattershot. There are a lot of chapters that I thought, like there's one chapter where he proposes, he calls it his 4 A's. The letter A, things like authenticity, things like agency. He talks about these are some of the tools I use in my own kind of therapeutic work with people. But it's a super short chapter, and he kind of blitzes through it. And I read that, and I thought this feels like it should be its own book, And maybe it is elsewhere, but the fact that it's just kind of threaded through in the middle, and then you move on to psychedelics, and then you move on to trauma, and then you move on to a chapter of a bunch of stories of different people who have healed from remarkable diseases and how they did it, and it just rolls through so many different ideas so quickly. It can feel a little bit like. I don't mean this sounds maybe a little harsh. I don't mean it quite this harshly, but it can feel a little bit like a mile wide, an inch deep kind of feel. Again, that sounds harsh because there is some depth of research here and serious depth of thought. But I think it's the grasp of the book. It's trying to really pose a strong argument that our culture, it's a huge argument to say our culture writ large is having a bad effect on people. And it's something I haven't commented on that's a significant aspect of the book are things like he starts to edge into critiquing our economic structures, critiquing our incentive structures around things like career and parenting and family structure, the pressures that parents experience, and the ways that those pressures affect very young children. And there's even a chapter on discussing the effects of stress on children that are in utero. And then there's a chapter on attachment theory and how does attachment play out in these young lives after they're born into these families that are incredibly stressed out by the pressures that are put on them in our culture. So and then there's discussions about, he doesn't do a full-throated proposal on policy and economic critiques or changes, but you can tell he has strong opinions about that. And so it even starts to edge into how can we possibly change the culture? And then there's a lot of stuff in there about personal kind of therapeutic, how do you live well? How do you pursue healing given that the culture does seem to be so toxic? So as you can tell, as I'm talking through this, there is just so many different, this is the stuff that at least a dozen books could be written about the contents of this one book. Just that could proliferate out and go into a really deep dive on any one of those topics. So I guess that's kind of the final thing I want to say. If you want a really big holistic argument that goes through a lot of different ideas and does pose some ways that these ideas all interrelate, then this is a great book if you want to kind of get a full scoped, kind of drink from a fire hose kind of critique and synthesis of ideas. However, if you're already familiar with things like attachment theory or the stresses on modern parents, if you've done other reading on some of our like cultural realities that are pressuring parents into certain, directions with their careers, and if you already have a strong opinion about kind of the direction of Western culture, things like opiate addictions and all that stuff, if you already have a lot of thoughts about that, there's going to be a lot of repetitive reading in here that's not going to go into as much depth as you might wish. So again, that's not like a full stop critique of the book per se, but it is something to be aware of as you read the book. And my reaction to it was, I'm at the end of the day, I'm glad I read it. I know I'm hedging a lot in my reaction here, but I am glad I read it for a couple reasons. It has one of the most helpful discussions, in my view, in some of the reading I've done. It has some of the most helpful discussions of trauma. It defines trauma is at the risk of being way overused to the extent where it might mean almost nothing today because it's just used so frequently. He has one of the most helpful discussions of how to use the word trauma well and what it means and why actually he does think it is so ubiquitous in our culture right now. I loved the discussion there. I loved his way he brings in attachment theory. I loved his discussion of the tension between kind of authenticity and attachment to people, how expressing kind of an authentic self and also suffering or attachment to caregivers and other people in our communities produces one of the most formative tensions and stresses that we experience in our culture today. I love that. I love that stuff. And I also liked the generally optimistic tone of the book. That's another thing I wanted to say, is that he proposes that the healing is really possible, and he's seen healing in his own life, and he's seen healing in the lives of others. And so from that angle, I really found it refreshing that he's actually putting forward, like, you can and should pursue healing because everyone needs it. And he includes spirituality playing a really decisive and important role in that path of healing, which I also found really refreshing. As, of course, I'm a minister, a Christian pastor, so of course I found that encouraging, but he doesn't pose one specific religious tradition, but he really is trying to reclaim the place of spirituality in the kind of holistic healing, and really honestly what it means to be human, that it plays a role. And so I found that really encouraging too. So I wanted to give some of my extended thoughts in my reactions book because, again, there's a lot in it. There's a lot to commend it. It also, at times, it felt like the reach exceeded its grasp a little bit, especially as it got into things like potentially political debates and discussions. Although I will say he has a chapter. One example on politics, he has a chapter that compares both Trump and Hillary Clinton and argues that they are both themselves evidence of the effect of trauma in a person's life, and it manifests extremely differently in the two of them as leaders, as potential political leaders. So I found that to be very even-handed, and I found that helpful, even if I wish maybe he would have trimmed out some of the other stuff that got outside of the lanes that he was trafficking in for most of the book. So, just a lot more I could say. This is already getting longer than I typically go with my book reviews. There's a lot more I could say about this book, but it is very readable. It is very well researched. There's a lot in here that I found very valuable, if at times I felt like it maybe was a little too unwieldy. But that is The Myth of Normal. Overall, very glad I read it. Very positive reaction to this book with some of those caveats and wrinkles and critiques that I mentioned earlier. But I wanted to feature on this channel because I know that it's an important book, and it's gotten some press behind it and some exposure, and I think his voice is really kind of unique, and so I would commend it if what I've described here is of interest to you. If you're a person who is on your own path of healing and figuring out how spirituality figures into that, and even wondering how our culture has affected you and your family, so on and so forth, you could probably get a lot from reading The Myth of Normal. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on this new book. Fascinating book. A lot that could be said about it. A lot more that could even be unpacked from it. So I commend it to you and hope that you found something in here thought-provoking, interesting, maybe discovered something new that you'll read. But as always, thank you for watching.